Today is May 18th, 2008. I am Eric Mishnick, and it is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Eureka, South Dakota. Can you please state your full name?
Richard Arnold Wiederanders.
All right. And when and where were you born?
Born in Clinton, Iowa, on the first day of September in 1924.
Okay. Have you ever heard an interesting story about your birth?
No.
Do you know if there was a midwife or a doctor present?
I don't know.
Could you please share some of your earliest memories with us?
We lived in Clinton, Iowa, on the campus of Wartburg College. The first residence that I remember was just across the street from the college campus. And this big old house was stucco on the outside, and it had a big front porch. And I'm trying to spot the earliest memories that I might have had there. But I don't know what it would be, because I lived in that house until I was 10 years old. And we slept in upstairs bedrooms usually with the windows open for ventilation. And there were squirrels in the walls, flying squirrels. Never could get rid of them. But Mother would always come in and tuck us in, and I remember one time she commented that she'd come up there on a cold night, and Bob would be over there on his bed with the bedclothes draped over his knees and the wind going through underneath. But it was a great place to live.
Let's talk a little bit about your family. Could you please tell me about your grandparents?
I never met a grandfather of mine. I was born in 1924, and my grandfathers died in 1923 and 1925. So I never knew a grandfather. That's because my father didn't get married until he was 35. And I didn't come along until third in his family. So it just wasn't right to meet a grandfather. But my grandmother, my mother's mother, lived with us for some time in Clinton and later in Waverly. Well, she didn't actually live with us in Clinton, but she was in town. Following the death of her husband, we had gone to Clinton. Her dad had gone to Clinton in 1919, and Grandpa Mix died in 1925, and by this time, the little family down there, there were Betty, Bob, and Dick, the three children, and Grandma worked for a family in Clinton as a cook and housekeeper. She worked for the Itons of Iton Biscuit Company, and so we would see Grandma. But that's as well as I could do with grandparents.
Okay. Could you state their names for us, please?
My mother's mother was Sophia Glauser Mix, M-I-X. And she was married at the age of 18 and had 2 daughters and 2 sons. My mother was the oldest. She was born in 1898. I don't have the dates here for, but we knew Grandma. We knew Mother's mother because when the family moved to Waverly, Iowa, the college moved from Clinton, Iowa to Waverly, Iowa, and for the first time, we lived in a house that belonged to the family. It was our first house, and this house was built just after World War II, and it was the first private home built in Waverly, Iowa after the war, and it was built with an upstairs apartment for Grandma. So I got well acquainted with Mother's mother.
Okay. What type of person was your grandmother?
She was, when I saw her wedding picture at age 18, I could understand because she was a spunky one. And when I knew her many years later, she was not only a good cook, but she was a gardener. And the thing that amazed me was that she could stand out in the garden, standing up and reaching down and pulling weeds between her feet without bending her knees. She was that supple. Amazed me.
Okay. Did your grandparents come over from Russia?
No. The Wiederanders family came from Annaberg in Saxony in Germany. And they landed in Texas in 1854. And they were, the Wiederanders family split into two groups at that point. They were churchgoers all the way, but there was a branch of the family that moved north and became and attended seminary in Iowa and Illinois, and were a part of the ALC. And those who were in Texas, the Texas branch of the family, were members of the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. And wasn't an awful lot of contact between those two branches for a while, but there were the Northerners and the Southerners, definitely. And they were both big into preaching and teaching.
Okay. Did your grandmother ever share any stories with you about Germany?
No. See, my grandmother was born in Leola, South Dakota. And my grandfathers I never knew. So it came down, it was Dad's job to tell the stories. And the stories that I heard of early times were early times in Eureka, where Mother grew up. I really never knew I never knew what a cousin was. It's as bad as that. And it was many years later when one of the Southern Wiederanders produced a family history that I got a lot of names and places. And we did get to Texas once in the 80s and meet a distant cousin of mine. But no, family reminiscences, hard to come by.
Okay. Was your grandmother religious?
What?
Was your grandmother religious?
Yes. I didn't. I never heard a lot about my grandma's marriage and her time here. I just knew that she had this preoccupation with the idea that her daughters would get all the education they could get. Her sons were another story. The older son did become a chiropractor eventually. He was a teacher and then a chiropractor. But the younger son kicked over the traces and joined the Navy when he was 17. When I tried to check his records later, they had his birth date wrong, of course. But he went into the Navy when he was 17 in 1927, I think. And that was his career. He was in the Navy until well after World War II.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about your grandparents?
Grandparents I scarcely knew.
Okay. Can you tell me anything about any of your uncles or aunts?
My closest relative in that category was mother's sister, Alma. Alma was a couple of years younger than Olivia, and they were both musical. They both played the piano, and so when we lived in Clinton and in Waverly, we had a piano in the house. Just a minute, the piano never got to Waverly, but when we lived in Clinton, we had a piano in the house. And Alma and my mother both played, and there was music in the house. Alma was also, as mother's little sister and living with us part of the time, she sort of adopted the kids. And my first books were gifts from Alma. Alma was a sweetheart, no way around it. She wound up later marrying a Swedish farmer from Wendell, Minnesota. And one summer I lived with Alma and her husband in Wendell, on a farm out of Wendell, Minnesota. So I knew Alma real well. She's on that picture, the 1944 picture.
Okay.
I did meet Uncle Carl because he would come to Waverly and visit his sister and his mother when he was on leave from the Navy. I also met him once in Portland, Oregon, when I was stationed there, and that was during World War II, and his ship came into Portland. So I met Uncle Carl. I met Mibbs too, somewhat. That's Milbert, the chiropractor. And I couldn't help liking Mibbs because when he came to visit the family and he got acquainted with all these little nephews of his, Dick, yeah, you're the one with the beautiful wife. Mibbs was a ladies' man.
Did you ever have any large family gatherings at that time?
No, large family gatherings just never happened. We worked at it hard later, but we had difficulty with the five of us in my immediate family, my siblings, and we never really had a get-together of the Big Ten of the five of us and our wives until 1999. when we spent a week together at a church camp in northern Wisconsin, and really, really had a family time.
All right. Could you tell us about your father?
Dad, yes. Dad was a workaholic. Dad was very focused on his career as a preacher and a teacher. I came to know early on that when he was preaching in the Dakotas, before he got married, he was working with the missionaries that were in New Guinea and bringing the story of the mission program into the congregations where he worked. And he and another young pastor generated a lot of correspondence between the congregations in the Dakotas and the missionaries in New Guinea. And they had these little Missionstunde, little German lessons that they printed up for the churches about the mission field. So that was one of my early impressions of Dad. Bob and I particularly became stamp collectors, and it was great because Dad was getting mail from all sorts of places, and so we collected stamps, and I became aware of this correspondence that Dad was doing regarding the Lutheran mission field in New Guinea.
Okay. And where and when was he born?
Dad was born in 1882 in Scotland, South Dakota. I understand that his dad, a very early pastor in South Dakota, raised a bigger family than was typical. Dad was child number 7 in that family, and parsonages for rural pastors in South Dakota were pretty hard to come by in those days. But I always got a kick out of the fact that my dad was born in Scotland. And I did visit Scotland once at an anniversary at that church. That was an unforgettable moment because I must have been around 10, and they decided to take a picture of all the people there for the anniversary. And lined us up in front of the church and took a panoramic picture of us. Well, I was just loose and running around before they took the picture, and I got a look at that camera, and I knew what it was. I saw that thing, that it was going to scan us like this. You know how those pictures used to be, big long pictures that they had? And I said, boy, what if I could do that? If I could sit over on the starting side and be on the end of it, and as soon as the camera starts, I duck around the back and get on the other side. Then I chickened out. I've never seen that a print of that picture, but I always thought, wouldn't that be a caper for you? That's my big memory of Scotland, South Dakota.
All right. How did your father express his emotions, such as fear, love, and anger?
Dad was never an angry person. Dad was, hey, when Grandma had to kill the chickens in our in our house. Dad was a very controlled person. But his affection for the family was never in question. He always had studying to do, but he liked to do his studying sitting in his favorite chair in the family living room. And this is where I knew my dad. Dad was always there, and he would get frustrated with his work at times, and he would take out his frustrations on the weeds in the garden, not on his kids. But the fact that he was so focused on his work and that he never learned how to take a vacation, but he was a great father because he understood that his problems shouldn't spill over into the family. And so he took up gardening. And the weeds in the garden caught all the flack.
Where were you and the rest of your brothers and sisters while he was in his chair?
Anywhere. Whatever the family was doing, swirled around there while Dad sat in the corner and watched and read and did his schoolwork or graded papers or whatever he had to do. Didn't bother him.
Could you describe your relationship with your father?
We all respected Dad intensely. We had him outnumbered. We had close siblings, you see. We were only 2 years apart. And so Dad was busy and we were busy growing up. And we had a great place in Clinton to be little kids because there was this whole college campus across the street from us. And out west of the campus, it went into the woods and down to the creek, and we had the free reign of the place, and the folks never restricted our ventures on the campus. It was a perfectly safe place for us, or it seemed that anyway. And so we had a marvelous place to run around, and the campus kids were a close bunch. There were others in our age group, and we just had the run of that campus. The college building itself, where Dad would be working, was a monster of a place, 3 stories high with an attic and a tower on the top of it, and the kitchen and dining room in the basement, and across the street from it was the barn and the cows and the horses. And all of this place was forbidden territory for us officially, but actually it was wide open. The kids ran through that territory just like mice. And in later years, as we started to grow up a little bit, we even had our own Boy Scout troop. We had discovered the Boy Scout manual, the handbook. And what good stuff was in that. So we got ourselves Boy Scout handbooks, and we used to meet up in one of the classrooms where we were not supposed to be at all. And the Wartburg Faculty Kids Scout Troop learned all the knots and all sorts of things, and that was just one of the many things we did up there. There was an occasion, which I never told my parents about, where it wasn't exactly a safe place to live, because none of us were swimmers, but there was a creek down there, and there was it was down west of the campus and down the hill and into the woods, and there was Mill Creek that went by, and this was college territory, I guess, but we used to go down there and fish for bullheads in the creek and explore around there, as kids under the age of 10 will do. And one time, there was a cliff above the creek, and we would have picnics up on the bluff up above the creek sometimes. And down along the creek, you could go between the cliff and the creek along there. And we used to go there and mine for gold. There was a streak in that of yellow stuff, and we'd get a tobacco pouch and fill it full of this gold. Yet we scrape it around in there. And one day when we were doing that, I just moved over and the side of the cliff slid down into the creek. Not an awful lot of it, but enough to be scary. Never told anybody about that because, I don't know, why make them worry? They didn't worry about us anyway. And there was another occasion when we had been down to the creek and we knew there was, we were on our way down to the creek, down through the woods, through the pasture, the college pasture, which was a ballpark, and into the woods and down to the creek. And as I started down there, I heard something hit next to me. And what in the world is that? And when we got down there, here was one of the college students, and he had a .22 rifle. And he had been shooting there, and he didn't miss me by 20 feet. But I never told anybody about that either, because that was a lesson I learned early, that some stories are to be told now and sometimes some are to be told later.
What type of food would you take on those picnics?
Food, as I remember it, was always a problem because we were in the Depression, and here we had a family with 4 kids and only one breadwinner, and the college wasn't exactly a wealthy institution. I remember food as being managed very prudently by my mother. I was aware that Mother ordered her food from Nissen's grocery store down in Clinton, a long ways away. They were members of our congregation. And she would get on the phone once in a while, and I'd hear her talking to Mr. Nissen and ordering out our groceries. And I came to understand that she would always tell him, you know we can't pay you for this now. And he would always come back with, that's all right, I won't worry about it. You just give me your grocery order and we'll deliver the groceries. And many years later, I found among Dad's papers the final receipt from Nissen Grocery for the grocery bill. You see, the college moved from there in 1935, and the Depression wasn't over by any means. But we still had a grocery bill at Nissen's, and he got his last penny, and I'm sure he never charged us a nickel of interest. Yes, I remember food. And at the table, the plates would be stacked in front of Dad, and Mother would have the food, and Dad would dish it out and pass it around the table to us. There was never a shortage. We never went hungry in that family. We always ate well, and if we complained about the food, we weren't taken very seriously.
All right. Going back to your father, you talked to him about being very focused on his work. What was his exact profession?
He was a teacher in a Lutheran college that was preparing young men for the ministry. He taught a variety of subjects, but his focus came into the problem of preparing people to be teachers. In his mind, being a preacher and being a teacher were just the same. The business of preaching is the business of teaching. And the business of the church was not only to preach the word, but to see to people's education and see to it that when they accumulated knowledge, they accumulated it in the context of the gospel. And so Dad was always working on this business of, I'm sure he taught German, he taught English, I don't know what else he taught, but finally he taught teachers. And many years later, after World War II, when we came back from the war, Dad had two of his sons in class teaching educational psychology. What a challenge. Here he had this whole bunch of young ex-GIs in his class learning to be teachers, and he was teaching educational psychology, and two of his sons are in the class. How are they going to handle that? It was quite an experience. He chose a textbook which the author was Pressey, and Pressey's philosophy of education was spelled out in this book. And as we went through the course, every time you turned around, it would hand you another little test, and you would take a test of a dozen or more true-false questions. And so as the course progressed, your score in the course was always a number. Your cumulative score on the daily and weekly tests that were always there there's no question about what your grade was in the class. And I thought this was most ingenious of my father, to get himself off the hook on how to grade his boys in the class. But I never told him how it was that I stayed at the top of that list. The thing went along, and I started to see a pattern. I began to get into the head of Mr. Pressey, the author of the book. And it seemed to me very early on that I could boil down his philosophy of education into a handful of principles. This, and this. And you take any one of those questions on his test and check it against the principle, against the 5 rules in his head, and you can get them right 9 times out of 10. And I never told anybody else about that. But I quickly went to the top of the class and stayed there.
Okay.
I think that was one of my greatest talents as a student, taking tests. What is the teacher going to ask, and what's behind it?
Okay. How did your father cope during the hard times?
Dad, he wasn't a great socializer. He wasn't a musician. He taught himself gardening. Gardening was a way that he could attack the problem. He smoked a pipe. I remember once that in the midst of all this, I commented to Mother. I said, you know, that can of Prince Albert cost 10 cents, and we could save some money if Dad would just quit smoking. She said, "Mind your own business. You're off base." That's how Dad coped. He took his frustrations out on the garden. He produced food for us in the garden, and he sat there and reveled in his family and smoked his pipe.
Okay. When, where, and how did your father die?
It was the pipe. My father died just short of his 72nd birthday of pancreatic cancer. He was teaching summer school in the summer of 1954, and we were up at the cabin in Canada. It was 4 years after we built the cabin, and we got a phone call to get home. Dad was in the hospital, and I had to take over his summer school class. And I finished his summer school classes, and Dad died in October. It went pretty fast. There was nothing to be done about it. But this was how his career ended. And Dad never took a vacation. He tried once. Or rather, Mother tried to make him take a vacation once. She put him on a riverboat in Clinton and said, send him down the river to take some time off and relax. He got off at Muscatine and came back. He would have none of it. Just wasn't built that way.
All right. Since you've told us about your father, could you tell us some memories about your mother?
Mother. Someplace in the early years, I became aware of the fact that my mother was a beautiful woman. How does this dawn on the mind of a kid who isn't 10 years old yet? But one night she came up to say goodnight to the boys. She sent us off to bed, and she came up to say goodnight to us all. And she sat on the edge of the bed. And I always knew that I had a soft spot in my mother's heart. But she sat there and talked to me, and she was beautiful. Her escape from the world was music. Mother, we had a radio, and Mother never missed the Firestone Hour on Monday night, which was classical music. Mother played the piano, not as well as Alma, but she played for the fun of it. And she liked to get a hold of sheet music and sit and play the piano. And she liked to have me come over and sing with her. And I liked that. Singing these Irish ballads at the piano with Mother was just great stuff. And these are the little ways that I built a bond with my mother. And there was music in our house, and when in elementary school we got into music, I took to it right away. I wasn't terribly musical myself, but I loved to sing, and there was a time when, about in second grade, I think, there was a Lutheran day school at Zion Lutheran Church in Clinton, and automatically we transferred from the public school to the church school for that time, and we sang a lot of hymns. And it was there at a very early age that I learned that there was harmony. There was more than one melody for a song when they went together. And this just fascinated me. And this was my mother's doing, you see. And actually, Alma, who lived with us for a while in Clinton when she was librarian at the college, she was a better pianist than Mother. She could play in any key, and she could change keys with facility. But these were my early impressions, and the fact that Mother gave us so much freedom and took such good care of us, well, it was never lost on me anyway. I don't know about the others.
was she born?
Mother was born in Eureka, South Dakota in 1898.
And how did she express her emotions, such as fear or love or anger?
Mother was a warmer person than Dad, but I don't know. We didn't talk about that sort of thing. Mother was a very capable parent, and fortunately, she had her daughter first, and she enlisted Betty as her staff sergeant, and she always. Between Mother and Betty, they had the home chores parceled out among us. We learned very early on that since there were many hands, the work was shared. And we all had our things to do, and we took care of that. And aside from that, we just had a lot of freedom. And that was good for all of us, I'm sure. Little things like our Boy Scout troop. Mother knew about it only peripherally, but the things that we had this big campus out there, a big playground for us. There was a gymnasium in the middle of the block across the street from our house, a big white brick structure with the gym floor up above the ground level, and as kids, we learned how to get into the gym any old time. We always had a way to get into the gym. So we could not only play around campus, but we could get into the gym and play with the gymnastic equipment and what have you. We had a good time growing up there.
Okay. Could you describe your relationship with your mother a little bit more?
I think that I sensed early on that the things I was interested in were the same things my mother was interested in. Many years later, I found out that she had been interested in mathematics as a student, and that one of her professors at Eureka College here, Reverend Professor Schaefer, really brought Mother along in mathematical studies, as well as could have been expected at the time. And I met him later because at one time he taught briefly at Waverly High School when I was there. He was, I wasn't that impressed with him at the time, but to find out that he had been my mother's inspiration in mathematics. Another thing about my mother that I remember was that I was aware of the fact that during the Depression, there were late evening business meetings between Mother and Dad in which they discussed the problem and how to handle it. And that early on, Dad had dismissed this idea, and he said, that's my problem, not yours. And Mother rejected that out of hand. She said, it's our problem, and we'll handle it together. And they always did. And it went a lot better for that, I'm sure, because I think Mother was a better numbers person than Dad. And that was a part of my identification with her, I'm sure. Her ability to do things methodically, her love for music, and her sharing it with me. And I remember at one time our second cousin, Roland, lived with us for a year when he was attending Wartburg. Roland was a little older than Betty even, and he was. This was a wonderful house. It had the stairs in the front and the stairs in the back, and you could run the loop. You could go up the front stairs and through the hall and back, over by the bathroom, and then down the back stairs by the kitchen. And I guess we were getting a little rambunctious. And I said, "What's going on up?" Mother called him, "What's going on up there?" He says, "Well, Bob and Roland or something." I said, "Tell Bob to quit." It was nice to have Roland around. And Betty was really smitten by her cousin Roland, of course. But Mother was keeping peace in the family, one way or the other.
Okay. What was your mother's profession?
My mother's profession was mother, pure and simple. She had trained as a teacher, but she was never real impressed with the teacher's training that she had. And let's face it, she graduated from Eureka Academy in 1916, and probably the normal school in Waverly in 1917, and in 1919 she was married. So Mother's career as a teacher was very much like my wife Millie, a little dabbling in it and then full-time housewife. So Mother's career was Mother, and she did a great job with her 5 kids.
Okay. How did she cope during the hard times?
Music.
You mentioned Irish ballads. What other types of music did she like to play?
Hymns.
Okay. And when, where, and how did she die?
Mother lived to the age of 85. Dad died in 1954 when Mother was 56. And so Mother lived a long time as a widow. And she cherished her family in those years, but it was not the easiest thing for Mother by any means. Mother's final project was supporting her youngest one, Bill. Bill was musical, and Bill went to seminary, and Mother didn't have much money, but she saved money anyway. I think Mother must have stumbled to that marvelously simple principle of budgeting, which I picked up sometime later out of a book. But on Mother's very limited income, she saved money and helped Bill go through seminary. Mother said, my brother-in-law Art, Betty's husband, put it pretty well. Art was a seminary professor, and his field was grief counseling. And he says, your mom simply outlived herself. She was living longer than her life. Her life was over, and she was done with it. She stayed in touch with her kids. She said goodbye to them all, and then she just lay down and died. At that time, I was teaching in Anchorage, Alaska, and I got the word and I flew down for the funeral, of course. But his mother just ran out of gas. During the years that we lived in Waverly, Mother was very active in the organization of faculty women, and I think she was instrumental in forming that group in Waverly. And she had a lot of friends, but Mother's life was basically her family, and her family was doing fine. They all got back out of the war safely, and Brother Bill was 10 years younger than me, so when I was drafted into the Army at the age of 18, he was only 8. And he turned 18 then, not in 43, but in 53. And so his time was the Korean War. And he was going to be drafted too. And Bill wasn't so dumb. Brother Bill was a music major at Ortford, and he tried out, he auditioned and got himself drafted into the U.S. Army Chorus. They didn't need him in the Army. And so he was drafted directly into the U.S. Army Chorus and was singing professionally on the East Coast in his Army career. And after he finished in the Army, he sang professionally in New York for several years until he ran out of voice and went into the seminary and became a preacher like his oldest brother. And so that's how Mother's career was extended, shall we say. Little Bill, her tag-along, was her special project.
How many children did your parents have altogether?
5. The 5 children in our family were born in 1920. Was Betty. 1922, Bob. I was born in 1924, and younger brother Don was born in January of 26, and then Brother Bill came along in 1934 as the tag-along in the family. So Bill was 1 year old when the college moved from Clinton to Waverly. The brothers were always close. We did well, and in later years, we got on a project together. We were back from the Army. Bob had graduated from college and was and got out of the Army, and he was in the seminary. And I had just graduated from college in 49. Don graduated a year earlier because he had more college in the Navy than I'd had in the Army. But in 1949, Don and I and another one of the faculty kids, Ed Newman, had a chance to spend a month in a cabin up in Canada. I'd never done any game fishing before. And we had a log cabin to live in, and it wasn't finished, but it was there. And we had an old boat and a little old motor that wasn't much, and we had a month there. And we looked around and we said, oh, we could build a better cabin than this. And besides, these guys who had built it were industrial arts people, and they had left a book on log construction there. And we read the book. So we can do better than this. And so we decided to see if we could build us a log cabin. And we searched around. We got a survey map of the lake, and we checked out all the places that were available for purchase. And we picked one out, and we applied to purchase it. And then we went back and we gathered partners. We got Brother Bob and Brother Don. Well, Don, Ed, and I, and Bob, and a buddy of mine from college who had been my roommate on choir tour. Lou was a music major, and he and I drank a lot of beer together. And so we had 5 partners: Bob, Dick, Don, Ed, and Lou. And we each put up $500, and we built ourselves a cabin. And when we went up on the summer of 1950 to build the cabin, we brought along little brother Bill to be our cook. The others were all back from the army. His older brothers, here's Bill's chance to get acquainted with his older brothers. So we took along and made him our cook. And we moved onto the island, and we built ourselves a cabin. And that's the tape that you got. That was a great bonding experience for us, and a great tie for us all together for the time after that.
Going back to your parents, who was the stricter parent, your mother or your father?
Who was the what?
The more strict parent.
Oh, Dad. Dad was more strict, I guess. But, hey, when you got 5 kids, even when you got 4, and you're that busy, and they've got that much room to run, there was no way that he could be strict over much of our lives, and so he set a good example for us at home, and he didn't ask too many questions outside. There was a time when I was in high school, and I had learned to dance, and Dad had said, "Well, members of my family simply do not attend public dances." Well, he wasn't able to make it 6. I came back on leave from the Army. What do you do for recreation? Go to USO. And he said, well, that's where his strict idea about this simply didn't relate to my experience in life, and he accepted that. Okay. But Dad had very strict ideas, but he also was intelligent, and he knew how to go with the flow. Mother was much less strict with us because her brothers weren't exactly the best role models. And Mother knew that whatever experience she had with boys probably wouldn't relate to the kind of children she wanted to have. I don't know how that played out in her mind at all, but my parents had a great deal of faith. And it rubbed off on me very nicely, because many years later, Millie and I were spending the year at Holden Village out in the state of Washington. And at Christmas time, we wanted, well, John was not available anymore, but Jane and Kurt, we wanted them to come out to Holden Village for Christmas. And so, okay, Kurt flew out to Seattle and met us at the airport. Jane hitchhiked out in December. Somebody asked me once, "Didn't you worry about her?" I said, "There's no point in it. Why should I worry? I got no handles on it. The thing's out of my hands. Just let it be. What I can't handle, God will have to handle for me." And I think my parents handled us very much the same way. You can't keep track of 4 kids who are run loose on this wide open campus and who have to walk over a mile to school in good weather. You can't keep track of them all the time. So you do your job and let God take care of the rest. And that was a great way to grow up. Considering how strict their own feelings were. Yeah, but hey, a very healthy attitude toward life.
Okay. Who influenced your life more, your mother or your father?
I think it was Mother for me, but that's not to say that Dad wasn't a strong presence there. Dad tried to teach us German when we were quite young. Simply didn't work. I took German in college, but the time to learn it is when you're a lot younger than that, and Dad didn't have time for as difficult a job as that. So we just grew up not knowing German. Oh, I could tell when they were talking about me, and I could generally tell whether it was good or bad, but as learning to talk German, no, it just didn't work. Right now, our youngest, Kurt, is finishing his master's degree at Iowa State University and living in Des Moines. Kurt is finishing his master's degree in history, and to do that he needs a foreign language capability. And probably he's done it already, but he had arranged with his advisor to take an oral exam, to take a translating exam. They'd give him